the government says that they did roll out a number of these schemes. In the earlier lot, they were called Atmanirbhar schemes. All sorts of mechanisms were created to make lending easier. A lot of money was made available to small businesses and so on. You're saying none of this actually had any impact?
See, at least a dozen economists have deconstructed those numbers, and they have come to the conclusion that the actual fiscal stimulus was only 1.3% of GDP. In fact, I was generous when I said it is about 1.7% of GDP. But what is 1.3% of GDP when your GDP has declined 7.3% in 2021? Please remember, the decline in GDP in 2021 was minus 7.3%.
Right.
So you should have done a much bigger stimulus. Many countries, comparable countries, smaller countries, bigger countries have done stimulus of 10% of GDP, 15% of GDP. We should have done at least 5 to 10% of GDP. My benchmark number was 10% of GDP.
Okay. Let me come back to a question on which we've conversed before as well, which is to do with the argument made in some quarters, including in some sections of the government, that the kind of cash that you are suggesting and others are suggesting be pumped into the economy in the form of cash transfers, especially to those who are economically vulnerable and so on, requires the government to have that kind of revenue in its hand, which particularly given this pandemic hit time, it doesn't have. Revenues are running short. To that you would say what?
Answer is borrow and spend. Even today, a newspaper has headlined as editorial, borrow and spend. That is stimulus. You borrow and spend. That is what America did. That is what every European country did. And look at America's bounce back. America's economy has bounced back sharply. So borrow and spend. In fact, I went a step further and I was endorsed by many eminent economists. You borrow and spend. And if you think the borrowing is going to an uncomfortable level, monetize part of the borrowing. Why do you have the power to monetize? The word monetize is not the FM's invention in this NMP. The word monetize originally meant that you monetize part of the borrowing if you think that the borrowing is uncomfortable. But I don't think our borrowing will reach uncomfortable level. The best antidote to what we suffered last year was to borrow and spend more. And where are you spending? You will spend on infrastructure. You will spend on other investments. You will spend on productive expenditure. And that will have its own returns.